Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of the most bizarre and bird-brained military experiments in history. Literally, you're crouched low in the brush, hands clutching a rusted helmet, while a shadow passes overhead. It's not a drone, not a plane, not even a hawk. It's a pigeon, a regular old feathered friend, but this one, it might be packing explosives. Yup, feathers, fury, and military-grade payloads. You probably won't survive this if you're on the wrong end of a bird strike carrying dynamite. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the battlefield, but not in khaki or armor. It's dusty. Your clothes are scratchy linen, and there's a sword in your hand that definitely weighs more than they made it look in movies. You're in ancient Persia, or maybe you're in Egypt, or Rome. The records blur like an old oil painting in a rainstorm. What matters is that this isn't your usual warfare. Above you, a bird cuts across the sky. Not a hawk wrong wing beat, not a vulture too fast. It's a pigeon, and it's got something tied to its foot. That's the first real moment humans figured out birds could carry messages. Clay tablets, papyrus scraps, tiny leather scrolls if it was lightweight and legible. It probably hitched a ride on a bird's leg at some point. Ancient Persians were among the first to truly formalize pigeon post. With swift white birds flitting across vast desert landscapes carrying military secrets. Romans did it too. Julius Caesar allegedly used pigeons to coordinate troops during his Gallic campaigns. Talk about going airborne. But this wasn't just ancient Uber Eats for messages. These birds were fast. The homing pigeon, or rock dove. If your fancy has an uncanny ability to return to its nest from hundreds of miles away. Scientists today still aren't entirely sure how they do it. Magnetic fields, sun angles, smell maps. Historians still argue whether it's the Earth's magnetic pulse or some internal GPS that keeps them on track. But you're just watching one disappear into the clouds, trusting that it'll make it home. Imagine the trust involved. You scribble a message, maybe it's enemy flanking west, maybe it's send figs. We're starving, and you wrap it onto a bird's leg, then let it go. You don't know if it'll make it. Hawks could snatch it. Storms could drown it. A sleepy archer might see movement and decide it's worth a shot. Still, empires gambled on these fragile flyers because the alternative was sending a rider through hostile terrain with a satchel and a prayer. You trudge forward a few hundred years. Now it's the Middle Ages, and Europe is a paranoid patchwork of fiefdoms, castles, and more betrayal than an episode of Succession. Pigeon posts flourish here too. In fact, by the 12th century, the Sultan of Baghdad reportedly had a regular pigeon mail system stretching across his territory faster than most human couriers, and definitely cheaper. Monarchs and military leaders grew obsessed with who controlled the sky, not with airplanes, but with flocks. There's something almost poetic about that. Isn't there? Wars turning on wings, secrets rising into the blue above, while armies march far below. Heads down, never suspecting the feathery espionage happening overhead. The only sound may be the wind flitting past feathers, or maybe nothing at all, just silence as the future of your side flaps away. Here's a quirky one in 1850s France. A guy named Paul Reuter, you know. The Reuters news agency guy started his career using pigeons to carry stock market info between Brussels and Aachen. He literally beat the telegraph in some regions. Traders waited not for emails or TikToks, but for a flock of birds to land with the day's financial gossip. Some were trained to fly in tiny suits, don't ask me how, and carried microfilm sewn into their lining. You're sensing a pattern. Right pigeons cheaper than spies, faster than horses, and way less likely to ask for a pension. Still, it's not all triumphs and winged miracles. You glance skyward again, and now it's the 19th century. The siege of Paris during the Franco-Prussian War is in full swing. Supplies dwindle, morale tanks, but up above, pigeons fly in and out, dodging Prussian gunners and falcons trained to intercept them. Some birds even carry tiny rolled-up photographs, shrunken through new microfilm tech and glued to their tail feathers. The first kind of airdrop surveillance, if you think about it. The funny part, people start getting suspicious of their own birds. That pigeon seems unusually muscular. One farmer jokes, but beneath the laughs, there's a genuine fear. What if enemy birds are watching us? What if we're sending out birthday party invites and getting back troop movements? Paranoia grows, and that seed of fear, it'll bloom hard and fast when the world wars roll around. But not yet. You're still in a world where pigeons are brave, noble, possibly wearing tiny helmets in our imagination. You smell the faint tang of parchment. You hear the flutter of wings. You feel the wind shift as another bird launches skyward. And in the corner of your mind, you ask if birds can carry news. What else could they carry? You duck beneath a sandbag wall, the sour sting of mud and metal in your nose, and wince as another shell explodes somewhere down the line. It's 1916, and the trenches of World War I are less a battlefield and more a slow-moving, miserable graveyard. Everything smells like damp wool, rust, and something worse that you try not to identify. You're cold, you're soaked, and your rations taste like compressed salt and sawdust. But you're not entirely alone. There's a bird in a basket next to you, blinking innocently, cooing softly like it doesn't realize it's sitting in a war zone. That's cher ami, or might be, hard to tell with the mud. Either way, this pigeon has a better chance of getting out of here alive than you do, and she might just save your life. Welcome to the age of the war pigeon. The British Army, and, to be fair, pretty much every major military power turned to pigeons during World War I because radios were still clunky, wires got cut, and runners tended to get shot. But birds, they could fly over no man's land like they were above all this human nonsense. You clip a note to a bird's leg, give it a kiss for luck optional, but morale matters, and release it into the chaos. Off it goes, bobbing between smoke columns, dodging sniper fire, probably wondering why humans keep doing this to themselves. The French were particularly all in. They had entire mobile pigeon lofts mounted on the backs of trucks, and thousands of trained birds stationed along the front. The Germans, same thing. In fact, One of the early moves in the war was trying to shoot down each other's pigeons. They even trained falcons to intercept them. Nature documentaries never cover that little skirmish, and here, the falcon gracefully rips the wings off an enemy spy pigeon mid-flight. You press your face against the cold metal wall of the trench. A fellow soldier just let his pigeon go. You both watch it ascend wings, gleaming like silver in the smoky light. He murmurs, "Hope it makes it." You both know that message is headed for HQ miles away, and that the difference between friendly artillery hitting its target or hitting you might come down to that bird. Here's your mainstream historical moment, cher ami, the pigeon who became a legend. She belonged to the U.S. Army Signal Corps and flew dozens of missions during the war. Her most famous flight was in October 1918, when over 500 men from the Lost Battalion were trapped behind enemy lines. The Americans mistakenly began shelling their position. Thinking it was the enemy, Cher Amy took off with a note tied to her leg. "We are along the road. For heaven's sake, stop it." She was shot through the chest, blinded in one eye, and still made it to 25 miles in under half an hour. The shelling stopped. Lives were saved. She got a medal. And yes, she got stuffed after she died, because apparently that's how we say thank you to hero pigeons. But this wasn't all heroics and glory. Sometimes the birds didn't make it. Sometimes you got your message back 2 weeks later, too late to matter. Or worse, the message never came back at all, and you never learned whether your pigeon vanished, defected, or just got tired of war and flew to Belgium to open a bakery. Who could blame them? And not all pigeons were created equal. Military commanders began to classify them by performance. Some were natural flyers, fast, nimble, unbothered by gunfire. Others, let's just say, there were probationary birds. You'd see one get released, only to land 5 feet away and start pecking at breadcrumbs. There's even an account of a pigeon in 1917 who delivered the same message back to the unit that sent it 4 times. Eventually, they gave him the same message and just stopped trying. It was probably for the best. But here's a fringe detail you probably didn't hear in school. Some soldiers believed pigeons had a sixth sense, that they knew when a unit was in dire need. One account claims a bird returned with its message 5 minutes before it had even been released. Obviously, that's nonsense. Or is it historians still argue whether pigeons simply responded to subtle environmental cues, or whether there's something more mysterious at play in their uncanny sense of timing and direction? In the trenches, the bird becomes a kind of talisman. You're not religious, but you catch yourself whispering a little prayer before sending it off. A whisper over feathers, a plea to something, anything that can reach the outside world. There's a strange intimacy in that, a little warmth amid all the rot and noise. You shift in your boots, which are soaked through. The soldier next to you jokes that the pigeons have better housing than the men. He's not wrong. Their lofts were cleaned, heated, guarded. They were fed good seed and checked for mites daily. Meanwhile, you haven't had a clean pair of socks in weeks, and the lice in your shirt are unionizing. Still, you look up again. You see another bird fluttering through the smoke. That same awkward, earnest rhythm. Not graceful like an eagle, not sleek like a falcon. Just a pigeon squat. Determined, persistent, kind of like you, really. And just when you start to feel a little sentimental, someone yells that another batch of birds is ready. You nod, grab the next message, and reach for the basket. The bird coos at you like it's unimpressed. You mutter, "Don't screw this up," and release it. There it goes, straight into the sky. But this time, someone from command is watching. Someone who's thinking beyond messages. Someone wondering if they can deliver a note. What else can they deliver? Because pigeons can be brave. But can they also be dangerous? You're back in Britain now. The bombs aren't falling yet, but the tension is thicker than gravy on a Sunday roast. It's the early years of World War II, and behind thick concrete walls, somewhere in London, a group of men and women with quiet shoes and serious faces is making a rather odd list. It includes the usual things: encryption tools, radio transmitters, maps, and then, in a separate column entirely, someone writes Pigeons carrier, experienced, welcome to MI-14D, the most feathered branch of British intelligence. You walk through the narrow corridors of this secretive wing and immediately notice the smell. Not gunpowder, not paper, birdseed. You wrinkle your nose. There's cooing behind one of the doors, and you swear someone just muttered, "She prefers the left shoulder, don't spook her." This is not your standard intelligence agency. This is the Pigeon section, formed in the early days of WTWT. MI-14D was a classified subunit of British military intelligence, and its mission was as straightforward as it was bizarre: train, deploy, and coordinate pigeons for wartime operations. Think James Bond, but with feathers and a severe grain addiction. Inside their offices, hidden beneath dusty ministry buildings and remote country estates, pigeon trainers, or loft managers, ran their feathered agents through rigorous training programs. The birds had to memorize routes, navigate unfamiliar terrain, and build the kind of muscle tone you'd expect from a Tour de France cyclist. These pigeons weren't just fast, they were freakishly reliable. Over 95% mission success rates. If human spies had that track record, we'd have won every war in record time. Your boots crunch on gravel as you step into one of the lofts. Hundreds of pigeon heads swivel toward you, beady eyes, twitchy necks. Some of them have names scrawled above their perches: Winky, White Vision, Commando. Others have numbers, but make no mistake, they're not just birds, they're assets. You lean in to read a clipboard pinned near the door. Winky Norwegian mission, 1942. Flew 120 miles over North Sea. Crew of RAF bomber rescued. There's even a medal drawn next to her name. Yes, medals. The British actually created an award specifically for animal bravery, the Dickon Medal. It's been called the Animal Victoria Cross. Between 1943 and 1949, 32 pigeons received it. That's more than most humans. Some of these birds have more accolades than your average war hero. And while you're pondering that, a handler walks past carrying a pigeon like it's royalty-gloved hands, soft cooing, whispered encouragements. You try not to laugh, but the handler says, "Dead serious. She saved my brother's unit." You salute her, and you do, because now you're starting to believe it. Now here's your quirky moment. Before pigeons could be officially recruited into MI-14Ds, they underwent what was essentially a bird job interview. They were tested for flight endurance, directional instinct, and even temperament. One report mentions a bird being unfit for service due to excessive moodiness. Another too social likely to loiter. Somewhere out there is a pigeon that got rejected from military service for being a little too clingy. But this wasn't just Britain collecting birds. No, they were launching a full-scale pigeon espionage operation, and that meant pigeons being dropped behind enemy lines. Literally, you're standing in a shadowy aircraft hangar now, the air buzzing with anticipation and diesel fumes. A special forces pilot points to a crate. That's the canister, he says. Inside one pigeon, one message capsule, some seed, and a polite request for local resistance to write back. You blink. Yep. The British dropped pigeons over Nazi-occupied Europe with tiny parachutes. Each bird was packed in a small capsule containing a pre-written message asking the finder to report enemy troop movements, rail schedules, and fortifications. The recipient would write their answers, tie the note to the bird's leg, and send it flying back to Britain. The plan: create a bird-based feedback loop of intelligence from deep inside enemy territory. Sometimes it worked. A farmer in France might find the bird, scribble down details about a convoy he saw pass through town, and release it. A few days later, that info helped guide an Allied bombing run. Other times, well, birds went missing, or they landed in the wrong hands, which leads us to one of MI-14-DOE's biggest fears: enemy pigeon units. There's a low buzz in the intelligence community now. German forces had their own pigeon units, equally secretive, equally trained. MI-14D even speculated that Nazi pigeons were operating over Britain, collecting information or intercepting British birds. You're not sure if that sounds silly or terrifying. Probably both. But back in the loft, one officer is gently fitting a new bird with a prototype device. It's small, sleek, sharp-edged, he mutters. If they can carry a note, why not something else? You watch him affix a tiny clasp to the bird's back. It's empty now, but it's meant to hold something: explosives, recon equipment. No one says it aloud yet, but you feel the idea forming. This bird isn't just for messages, she's for missions. Still, the loft smells warm. The birds fluff and rustle, oblivious to the weight of history settling on their wings. You crouch beside one that tilts its head and pecks your boot. It's hard not to anthropomorphize them. They look so gentle, so harmless. But someone behind you clears their throat and says, "We're testing incendiary payloads next." And you wonder, how far are they willing to go with this? You're standing in a field somewhere in the English countryside now, sun filtering through gray clouds, sheep in the distance, and about half a dozen military officers in long coats watching a wooden crate like it's about to explode, which technically it might. The crate rattles once, then again. Someone whispers, "Any minute now." Suddenly, with a pop, the lid flings open and a pigeon rockets skyward, except this one's carrying more than just a note. Tethered under its belly is a small, streamlined package, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes. It glints in the light. You're now watching the British experiment with something they're not officially supposed to be doing, turning pigeons into delivery drones for, well, not just love letters. Welcome to the strange, controversial chapter in pigeon warfare weaponization. The idea wasn't born out of malice. It was born out of desperation. The early years of EOQ were brutal. Britain was isolated, under aerial siege, and needed every edge it could get. And if pigeons could navigate through flak, enemy fire, and sheer chaos with uncanny precision, why not use that same talent to carry something deadly? This is where things start to feel a little ethically itchy. You look around, wondering if anyone else feels weird about this. A handler gives a casual shrug. They've carried firebomb blueprints, camera film, cyanide capsules. If it fits in the tube, it flies. Let's slow down, because the concept of pigeons as weapons didn't begin in Britain. It had earlier origins, stranger ones. Backtrack to the 1940s in the United States, where B.F. Skinner, yes, the behavioral psychologist known for his work with operant conditioning, was proposing a project called Project Pigeon, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Skinner believed pigeons could be trained not just to deliver messages, but to guide bombs. He built prototypes in which pigeons would sit inside the nose cone of a missile, pecking at a screen that displayed the target. Peck left missile adjusts left. Peck center missile stays on course. These birds would, quite literally, steer explosives toward enemy ships. It was ridiculous. It was genius. It was shelved. Historians still argue whether Skinner's idea was genuinely viable or just an eccentric academic fantasy. The Navy loved the low cost. Scientists loved the innovation. But bureaucrats, they couldn't stomach the idea of bird-brained missiles, even in war. There's a line, maybe. You blink. A pigeon just landed nearby, trailing a bit of smoke from its feet. It's fine, just a test flare, but your heart jumps. These aren't messenger birds anymore. They're part of a new playbook. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Mi-14D and similar units were testing pigeons with lightweight reconnaissance gear. Tiny cameras strapped to their chests, set to snap photos every few seconds. Imagine that before drones, before satellites. You had flocks of birds unintentionally revolutionizing spy photography, and some of the images were good, grainy, sure, but you could make out roads, convoy lines, anti-aircraft placements. It wasn't perfect, but it was real intel, smuggled out via wings. In one case, a bird flew over a German U-boat base and returned with images clear enough to prompt a bombing run. But then came the darker possibilities. You're handed a prototype pouch, soft leather, reinforced seams. Inside, there's a smooth, egg-shaped object about 200 grams, just light enough for a pigeon to carry. An experimental incendiary meant to ignite on impact. You close it gently and hand it back. You don't ask if they actually used it. The documents are fuzzy. Some historians believe no pigeon ever dropped a bomb in active combat. Others suggest there were field tests kept off the books. Still others whisper of missions in occupied France, where birds carried small sabotage devices, acid vials for documents, mini-timers for locks. Nothing spectacular, just quiet disruption, tiny, winged inconveniences. And here's your emotionally immersive moment. One officer, years later, admitted he stopped participating in those experiments, not out of failure, out of guilt. He'd grown attached to a pigeon named Hattie Stubborn, a little scrappy, always returned late but with perfect accuracy. They fitted her once with a training device meant to simulate a live payload. She didn't come back. He never knew if she got lost, or something worse. He just stopped volunteering after that. And if you're wondering, no, the British public didn't know. Not during the war. They saw posters encouraging them to report any found birds and to treat pigeons like allies. Some were even told to offer them shelter if they seemed lost. Few knew those birds might be packing heat, literally, but not every plan was sinister. One side project delivering morale. Imagine you're hiding in a barn attic in Nazi-occupied Belgium. You've got a radio, barely, but you're starving. Then, thump a bird lands near your window, holding not just orders, but a chocolate bar. Someone in British intel thought it'd help. It did. Still, as the war drags on, the tone shifts. MI-14D begins to phase out the more aggressive bird programs. Technology is catching up. Radio miniaturization, better parachute drops, even spy planes. Pigeons start to seem quaint, but they never fully disappear. Even decades later, during the Cold War, you can find rumblings in Soviet intelligence files of pigeon-trained espionage tactics. Paranoid, maybe, but then again, a bird flew over East Berlin in 1962 and was shot down. It had an empty film canister tied to its leg. Maybe it was just a confused tourist. Maybe not. Now, standing beside a half-disassembled pigeon carrier marked confidential, return to London. You find yourself wondering if the line between helper and weapon ever really mattered. Did it matter to the birds, to the people who loved them, to the enemies who never saw them coming? And behind you, one final crate rattles. Another mission, another feathered recruit. But next, you'll see what happens when pigeons aren't just part of the war, but pawns in a game of secrets no one quite understands. It's late evening now, the kind of sky that feels like it's holding its breath heavy. Low-hanging clouds that never quite decide whether to rain. You're walking through an old British manor house, repurposed during the war as an intelligence hub, the kind with creaky floorboards, wainscoting, and too many rooms for comfort. Somewhere deep inside, pigeons coo behind blackout curtains. But this time, the conversation is quieter, more strained. Something's wrong. You pass a meeting room, dimly lit, where two officers are hunched over a desk. Between them sits a single pigeon, feathers puffed, eyes sharp. You only hear a snippet intercepted, origin unknown. This, right here, is where the story gets murky, mysterious, paranoid, because it turns out, for every pigeon with a mission, there might be another one working for the other side. You're now deep in the bizarre world of counter-espionage and pigeon paranoia. It all begins with something historians still debate to this day: the intercepted birds. British intelligence began receiving reports of pigeons that seemed to be flying against the wind, literally and figuratively. Some were captured near military installations, bearing German markings. Others were found with messages in code that didn't match British formats. Occasionally, their message tubes were empty. Why were they decoys? Sabotage attempts. Were the Germans testing British defenses, using pigeons as bait? Historians still argue whether these pigeons were actually part of a German counterintelligence strategy, or whether Britain was simply on edge. Either way, MI-14D took the threat seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they authorized a bizarre new initiative, anti-pigeon patrols. Imagine this British Home Guard volunteers stationed along the southern coast, not to look for boats or planes, but for birds. Trained spotters with binoculars were told to be vigilant for suspicious pigeon activity. The memo literally advised locals to detain pigeons loitering in secure areas or behaving erratically. Somewhere out there was a granddad with a shotgun who probably told his mates at the pub, "Bagged me a spy pigeon today." And here's your fringe tidbit in one reported case. A farmer in Sussex captured a pigeon with a tiny message written in lemon juice, invisible ink. The message, once revealed, Siska included coordinates and references to British troop locations. The incident was enough to cause a temporary lockdown of the entire region. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others weren't so sure. MI14D went even further. They began collecting pigeon DNA, not for cloning, don't get excited, but for tracking lineage. Certain lofts in Europe were thought to breed especially skilled pigeons, and there was concern that German spies might be slipping trained birds into Britain under the guise of domestic flyers. So the British began testing feathers and comparing flight patterns. It was like CSI Aviary Edition. And then came the strange case of the double agents. You're seated now in a small, smoke-filled back room. There's a large map on the wall, pins marking suspected drop zones. A grizzled intelligence officer explains some birds were caught, but we didn't kill them. We turned them. He grins. Let 'em go with our messages instead. False intel. Send 'em back to Berlin with stories of non-existent tank battalions. Moved the whole front line 3 miles south, thanks to one bird named Albert. You blink. Did Britain just run a disinformation campaign using a traitor pigeon? Absolutely. Whether it worked every time, that's harder to prove. Some of the intercepted birds never made it home. Some may have switched allegiances, mid-air tempted by breadcrumbs and British hospitality. Others just vanished. That's the problem with pigeons. You can't interrogate them. You can't break their silence. You can only watch the sky and wonder. And this paranoia went both ways. British spies operating in occupied France often suspected their birds were being intercepted. One field report stated, "Pigeon did not return. Possible redirection or compromise." Last seen circling Rouen. They noted the word circling 3 times. Was the bird confused, injured, or did it betray them? That emotional chill creeps in as you read another document, hand-scrawled by a resistance courier. It ends simply, "I do not trust him. His eyes are not honest." He was referring, yes, to a pigeon. Now take a breath, because things are about to get even stranger. In 1944, Britain received credible intel that Germany was developing counter-pigeon falconry. Yes, enemy forces were training hawks and falcons to patrol key areas and take down suspicious birds. If you're imagining mid-air dogfights between bomb-laden pigeons and Nazi falcons, you're not far off. One British handler allegedly trained his birds to fly at night to avoid avian interception. Another fitted his best flyer with a false feather pattern camouflage for pigeons. And here's a sensory-rich moment for you. Imagine standing in a French vineyard at dawn. Dew clings to the leaves. You reach into your coat, pull out a pigeon, attach a note written in hurried, tiny script. You kiss the bird's beak superstition and toss it skyward. It vanishes into the rising mist. You listen, straining, and then hear it, the cry of a falcon. You don't know if the message will make it. You just walk away, slower than before. By now, the British Pigeon Corps is obsessed with security. Loft locations are guarded, breeding lines are classified, messages are written in multiple layers of code, and when a bird goes missing, a full report is filed. Some birds even have code names. You flip through one log and read Agent 47B, presumed lost over channel. Last contact, Eero 4, 52 acres. It's all so human. And that's the most bizarre part, isn't it? Somehow, through the chaos and brutality of war, the lines blur. These birds aren't just tools. They're comrades, assets, sometimes scapegoats, occasionally heroes, but almost always caught in a game they can't possibly understand. You look up. Another bird is being released. Its wings beat once, twice, and then it's gone, just a blur against a bruised sky. No one speaks, because in this weird war of whispers, even silence might be watching. You haven't even seen what happens to these birds after the war. Not yet, but soon. You will. You wake up to silence too quiet, almost sacred. The war is over. The air doesn't smell like gunpowder anymore, but of dew-covered brick and tea kettles whistling from open windows. There's a hum of recovery, of life tiptoeing back into the corners it once abandoned. You're in London now, though it hardly resembles the postcard version. Bits of rubble still litter the edges, scaffolding frames half-rebuilt homes. Yet amid all this, something unexpected happens. A parade, not just for soldiers, not just for politicians, but for pigeons. Yes, pigeons. You blink twice as you read the banner flapping overhead. Welcome home, feathered heroes. And there, trotting beside decorated war veterans and military brass, is a small cage on wheels. Inside, perched with all the pomp of a royal guard, is a plump, soot-streaked pigeon wearing a miniature medal. It's not a joke. It's not satire. This is serious respect. See, the war may be over, but the gratitude remains. Over 250,000 pigeons served with British forces during World War II, and now some of them are getting what can only be described as celebrity treatment. There's even a medal for it, the Dickon Medal, often called the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. It's awarded to animals displaying conspicuous gallantry in service. Among the earliest recipients, a pigeon named Winky. Winky saved a bomber crew stranded in the North Sea. She flew 120 miles back to her base with oil-slicked feathers. Delivering no message, but her arrival allowed a rescue team to triangulate the crash site. Every crew member survived. She got a medal. You look at her tiny, determined beak on a rusted newsreel clip and feel something pride-guilt. Maybe a bit of both. Not all pigeons made it back. Some ended up lost over enemy territory. Others succumbed to exhaustion, weather, or predators. And the ones who did return often carried unseen scars. Wartime handlers reported birds that grew skittish, refused to fly, or circled endlessly as if unable to trust their own wings. Here's your emotionally immersive moment. You're sitting beside a veteran pigeon handler in a quiet countryside loft. He holds an old bird gently in both hands, feathers faded, beak chipped. She's the last, he says, voice soft, outlived every mate, every mission. Won't fly anymore, but she still coos when I walk in. He doesn't say her name out loud, maybe because some memories don't want to be shared, they just want to exist. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some pigeons were given honorary military ranks. One bird, Gustav, was known as Private First Class Gustav by his squadron. Another, our Patty, was labeled the fastest wing in the West for crossing the channel in record time. Their photos were hung in officers' lounges. One was even interviewed by the Daily Mirror. Try explaining that to someone who's never seen a pigeon in uniform. After the war, many of these birds were demobilized, a weirdly formal term for being sent back to civilian lofts. Some went to breeders. Others were kept by their handlers. A few were ceremoniously retired to London's zoos and bird parks, where children could visit and toss them grains like they were tiny old soldiers. But not everyone was sentimental. By 1946, budget cuts began sweeping through the British military. Pigeon programs were among the first on the chopping block. My 14D was quietly dissolved, its files sealed or reallocated, and the once busy mobile lofts were sold off at auction. Some became garden sheds. One reportedly turned into a pub outhouse. And yes, historians still argue whether this was the right call. Some believe pigeons could have remained vital through the Cold War. Others think the tech had simply outpaced the birds. Still, a few in military intelligence pushed to keep the training centers running, just in case the radios ever failed. But you can't hold on forever. One of the more poetic post-war reports describes pigeons who kept returning to their old bases long after the soldiers had left. Empty airfields, crumbling lofts, grass grown wild, but there they were circling, landing, waiting, like ghosts in feathers, reluctant to let go of duty. And yet, this isn't a sad ending, because pigeons, for all their wartime service, found their way back into peace. Some handlers started breeding clubs. Others entered their pigeons in civilian races, turning old messengers into champions of sport. One veteran joked, "She spent the war dodging flak. Now she dodges Yorkshire rain. I think she prefers it." And here's your sensory-rich detail. Imagine a summer fair in 1951. You're holding a warm paper cone of chips, the scent of vinegar in the air. A boy beside you cheers as a pigeon crosses the finish line at a community race. The crowd erupts, not because they know what the bird did during the war, but because she's beautiful and fast and alive. That's legacy. Not in medals, not in files, but in flight. Still, you can't help but wonder, what if these pigeons hadn't been demobilized? What if they'd been kept on, upgraded, trained further? Would there have been a new era of avian espionage? Could the Cold War have had its own covert pigeon front? Some historians think yes. There are classified files from the 1960s that suggest experimental pigeon units were proposed again, this time with microtransmitters and chemical sensors. But none of those programs fully took off. Budget, politics, skepticism, it all clipped their wings. Even so, pigeons didn't disappear completely. Into the 70s and 80s, you'd still hear rumors, especially around the Berlin Wall. A captured bird here, a strange flight path there. Some believed that someone, somewhere, was still sending messages by wing. The final cliffhanger, one last photo. It's in a dusty file, unlabeled, from 1981. A pigeon, mid-flight, carrying a pouch marked with both Cyrillic and English letters, found by a shepherd near the Austrian border. Contents classified. Sender unknown. Destination: still debated. The Cold War had its secrets. Maybe the birds kept a few of their own. You're in a musty library now. Not the modern kind with glass walls and coffee carts. No, this one's the real deal. Oak shelves, faded green desk lamps, that unmistakable scent of ancient paper and dust that's been filtered through decades of whispers. You're here chasing threads, pigeon threads, because long after the war, long after the parades and pigeon races and medals pinned to tiny chests, the real secrets start surfacing. You leaf through a declassified dossier stamped restricted eyes only. It creaks when it opens. The file begins simply, Re-Operation Columba. Remember that back from Section 3, the top secret operation that dropped thousands of pigeons into occupied Europe in canisters like feathery missiles of hope. Turns out, many of those birds weren't just gathering intel, they were gathering people, specifically names. See, the British weren't just interested in military positions or troop movements. They wanted resistance, civilians willing to risk it all to fight from within. And so, many of the returned pigeon messages didn't include coordinates. They included names, addresses, coded offers. Yes, I will help. We have 8 in our cell. Send a radio. Some of these people were later recruited, funded, and even armed through SOE channels. Others were quietly used, then left behind. And here's your emotionally immersive moment. One letter, handwritten and folded tight inside a pigeon's capsule, simply reads, "They took my brother. I will not forgive. Tell them we are ready." The bird that carried that message didn't survive the return flight. A falcon got to her over the channel, but another pigeon, sent the next day with a repeat of the letter, made it. That one changed the course of a small but deadly resistance movement in northern France. Now here's the fringe tidbit that raises eyebrows among the documents. There's a single memo from 1942 referencing an experimental program, Operation Hermes. The proposal trained pigeons to recognize specific facial features. The theory was that pigeons could be conditioned to peck at images of enemy officers during controlled tests. If successful, the birds would be used in field kits to identify high-value targets by peck selection. Yes, pigeon reconnaissance, facial recognition. Historians still argue whether the program was real or just a fever dream cooked up by an eccentric intelligence officer with access to too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But multiple pigeon handlers recall weird drills involving photo boards and treats. One even claimed his bird could recognize Hitler's face from a black and white portrait and consistently chose it over a lineup of other generals. Whether that's science or pub story, still unclear, but now you're deep in it, and so is your pulse, because the more files you read, the more tangled it gets. There are reports of pigeons used in covert psychological operations, birds released near enemy encampments with fake messages suggesting sabotage, betrayal, or even fabricated rendezvous points. The idea was simple sow confusion, make the enemy doubt each other, and waste time chasing phantom spies. One handler wrote, "The bird didn't even need to be believed. It just needed to be found." But some missions went darker. In 1944, a pigeon labeled only X-14 was deployed with a capsule containing not a message, but a vial. Inside the vial, a compound that modern analysts believe might have been a chemical tracer. If released inside a building, it would allow Allied agents to track where high-value enemy personnel had been within the structure based on contamination readings. Of course, X-14 never came back, and the building it was headed toward flattened by an air raid 3 days later. You close the folder. The weight of it presses against your ribs. Let's talk about aftershocks, because the legacy of pigeon intelligence didn't just vanish into post-war civilian fluff. You discover that several Cold War-era agencies studied these bird-based operations closely, especially the USSR and China. In fact, there's a 1968 memo that claims Soviet intelligence bred pigeons capable of flying 600 kilometers with precision, reportedly using geomagnetic training techniques. One Western analyst scoffed, "Sounds like pseudoscience with feathers," but another replied, "So did radar." Once, by the 1970s, Britain had effectively shuttered all formal pigeon programs, but not everyone followed suit. The French kept a reserve force of messenger pigeons until 2000. No joke. And as of today, the Indian Army still maintains an official pigeon unit. For emergencies, for nostalgia, maybe a little of both. Here's your sensory-rich detail. You're in the Pyrenees in the late 1990s. A light drizzle taps against your coat. A French officer, older than the mountains, leans over a coop and pulls out a gray-feathered bird. He strokes its back and says in a whisper, "She knows the sky better than I know my own hands." Then, with a kiss to the beak, he releases her. She vanishes into cloud like a secret, fading from memory. Now let's circle back to the Brits. Decades later, a small but dedicated group of pigeon enthusiasts, many of them grandchildren of wartime handlers, start petitioning for broader recognition. They want plaques, monuments, names etched in brass. If they served, they deserve. They argue. Eventually, they get it. In 2019, a memorial was unveiled in the National Memorial Arboretum, honoring all animals in war, including the humble pigeon, carved wings, a weathered perch, and at the base, a list of names: Patty, Winky, Gustav, Mary of Exeter. Yes, Mary made it too. Remember her? The one who flew even after injuries and stitches. She died peacefully in her coop, a national treasure, age unknown. And just when you think it's over, one final twist. A university in Cambridge recently launched a research project using artificial intelligence to study pigeon navigation models. Their goal: apply the bird's legendary mapping skills to modern drone technology. It turns out, pigeons still fly faster and more efficiently over long distances than many autonomous systems. So here we are, full circle, from war pigeons dodging bullets to drones dodging skyscrapers, guided by the echoes of ancient wings. And maybe, just maybe, in the algorithms of the future, there's a bit of Winky, a flicker of Gustav, a flash of feathers that never stopped flying. One more section left, one more story to land. You're standing at the edge of a field. Early morning mist curls along the grass like the last whispers of a fading dream. Somewhere out in the distance, a shape breaks the quiet small, swift, precise. It's a pigeon, arcing toward the horizon with impossible grace. wings slicing through the air like a promise no one quite understands anymore. This is where it all ends, and oddly, where it all begins again, because in the soft, fading glow of history, the story of Britain's wartime pigeons refuses to die. You walk past a stone memorial small, almost overlooked, nestled near a crumbling manor that once held a secret training loft. The plaque reads, "To those who flew without fear," and underneath, the faintest etching of wings in mid-flight, the quietest sort of rebellion, remembered by the quietest kind of hero. But let's rewind, just once more back to the files. The sealed ones, the ones that didn't get declassified with the others. Rumors still swirl among niche military historians about MI-14D having a shadow successor, a splinter operation formed not long after the original Pigeon service was disbanded. The theory that a few high-ranking officers believed Pigeons still had unmatched tactical value and quietly redirected funds to continue limited training programs. They weren't planning for World War III. They were preparing for silence, EMP attacks, communication blackouts, global catastrophes. And here's your quirky tidbit. One such story tells of a private aviary hidden in a forest outside Cornwall, owned by a retired colonel who reportedly trained a new line of black feather pigeons, darker, sleeker, harder to spot in low light. He claimed these birds could deliver messages across 150 miles without once rising above tree level. Was he mad? Maybe. But his logs show that dozens of birds made the trip. Still, no photos, just names and dates. The birds, as always, kept their secrets. In 2003, a strange report emerged from Iraq during the invasion. British troops stationed outside Basra described intercepting a pigeon carrying a small pouch not unusual, except for the microchip embedded in the strap. When analyzed, the chip revealed not GPS or comms data, but a cryptographic hash string, like something lifted from a spy novel. No one claimed it, no one explained it, but deep in a MOD report, one analyst scribbled, "Could this be legacy Columba code?" Historians still argue whether it was real or just a prank by a tech-savvy soldier with a flair for drama. But some argue it proves something larger, that pigeons were never just a wartime blip. They were a proof of concept, a moment where nature and necessity collided. And like all good ideas, they never truly vanish. They just molt, evolve, re-emerge in forms we don't always recognize. You pause now, watching another bird, a modern one, perhaps tagged and tracked by scientists. It glides past a drone. They don't compete. They coexist, one coded by instinct, the other by algorithm. Here's your emotionally immersive moment. You're in a loft again. A teenager sits cross-legged beside a pigeon coop in Sheffield. Her grandfather once trained birds for the RAF. Now, she does it for racing. But tonight, as the sky darkens, she leans in and whispers to her favorite bird, "This is for you, old man. Let's see if she beats the wind like you used to." And the bird does. She launches like a shot, vanishing into the purple dusk. The teen watches, and in that stillness, that heartbeat of silence, there's something ancient and eternal. You feel it too, this thread of flight, stretching across generations, carrying messages we no longer write, but still somehow need. Now for your final sensory-rich detail, feathers brushed by evening air, their edges catching just enough light to look like silver, a flutter that's barely sound, the kind of quiet you feel more than hear. And here, the soft cliffhanger, perhaps the gentlest one yet, because last year, in an unused Royal Signals outpost, a janitor discovered a rusted cage buried beneath floorboards. Inside, a tiny scroll in a glass vial, faded but intact. Scientists have yet to fully decipher the message. Some think it's just a practice slip. Others believe it's the final flight log of a bird that never made it home. You let your breath slow. The story stretches behind you now, soft as twilight, no longer filled with gunfire or codes, just memories, just wings. These pigeons, fragile and ferocious, carried messages, secrets, and hope across skies torn by war. They never asked for recognition. They never questioned the orders. They flew because they could, because someone believed they would, because silence couldn't be trusted, and something needed to break through the noise. They remind you that even the smallest creature, the least likely, can shift the weight of history. That bravery doesn't always come with a roar. Sometimes it comes with a flutter. And sometimes, victory isn't measured in explosions or flags, but in whether a single bird makes it home through the storm. Tonight, you close your eyes to the rhythm of flight, soft wings, steady heartbeats, tiny beaks nudging open the locks of history. The war is long over, but somewhere, out there, something still circles above us, watching, remembering. The lights are low now. The story is over. See you tomorrow night. Sweet dreams.